We're in a very dangerous territory of the mainstream media platforming those that wish to see the end of universal healthcare more and more often. A guest appeared on LBC by the name of Reem Ibrahim, who was calling for the end of the NHS as we know it, and instead calling to replace it with a free market-based system. I'm going to go through the clip and break down each argument. Much of it is just hyperbole, and she uses a few buzzwords such as funding, black hole, and bureaucratic. It's also worth noting that she's a right-wing commentator and a self-described libertarian. Now, libertarians believe on principle that the free market is the best way forward, which includes healthcare. So we need to understand that her position is coming from a perspective where they principally believe this, regardless of logistics, facts, etc. This isn't someone who looked at the evidence and came to this conclusion. Rather, they are exploiting the failures of our government. So, let's go.
We spend just below £200 billion on the NHS every year.
So this is slightly misleading. According to the BMA, we spent £220 billion last year on the NHS, but not every year. It's true that the cost is rising, and you can see from this graph that the cost has gone up over time. So it's a bit of a misdirection that we spent this amount every year as if that's the cost of having an NHS. We also need to take into account inflation. Inflation is something that affects everything, so we can't blame the NHS for that one, can we? Another reason is the cost of energy, because of course the NHS uses energy. Once again, not the fault of the NHS, but the fault of the cost of living, especially energy prices, which because we've allowed the free market to control our energy, well, this is what the free market has decided what is best for society, rocketing prices with huge profits for companies. Can you imagine the same for healthcare? Or will the NHS suddenly be different to every single failed free market experiment on monopolistic services? Maybe if we just privatise one more thing, it will eventually work.
We've got a National Health Service that has failed time and time again in order to deliver for the people. I mean, we're letting down taxpayers, but we're also letting down patients. We're also letting down nurses and doctors who work tirelessly within the National Health Service. I think that we need to have a very honest conversations with ourselves as a country and think about whether or not the NHS is actually a feasible solution for healthcare in this country.
Well, she's right. I mean, no one's going to disagree with that, are they? The NHS has failed patients and workers, but why? You can't make this statement and then remove all context as to why that's the case. It's simply a fact that the government are not only incompetent, but they also have an agenda, as with all of our public services, is to destroy it and pave the way for privatisation. Now, don't just take my word for it. On average, healthcare spending has increased between 3 to 4% every year since its creation. Now, obviously, this is down to more people using the NHS, an aging population, so of course this is entirely necessary. Here you can see before 1979, annual growth was just under 3.7%. From 1980 to 1997, the Tories only slightly but still underfunded it. They didn't match the annual growth. Then between 1997 and 2010, the Labour government doubled the average annual growth and increased its funding to 6%. That is huge. It's no coincidence that patient satisfaction was at an all-time high. The NHS, despite the problems of PFI and the decisions of New Labour did on, how it was funded, the simple fact is, not only did they fund it, but they injected huge amounts of money. Then what happened? You can see that from 2010, it was completely slashed to below 2%. The biggest ever cut in the NHS's history. This was also thanks to the Lib Dems and the coalition, so they're not getting off this lightly either. Now, from 2015, it did increase, but still below average levels. But the context here is that due to a huge cut in spending, you have to see spending levels like New Labour, and actually probably far more, to recover from the shocking levels of underfunding. Now you can see from this graph that under Boris Johnson, the funding had more than doubled. But, as I pointed out, due to hyper-austerity, you can't just increase it back up to normal levels and then think it's fixed. The damage austerity has done on society is monumental. Therefore, it takes an equally monumental response to get us out of this mess. Then, of course, the pandemic hit, and yes, spending increased to deal with it. So that's the context of spending on the NHS. Despite people pulling out big, scary figures, the reality is it's been systematically underfunded.
I think that actually a more free market healthcare system where we put the consumer at the heart of it is really where
so
we need to go.
privatise it.
Yes, well, essentially, yes. If we privatise the NHS, but actually, if we were to think about a voucher system, think about the Singaporean system, the Swedish system, the German system. There are countless examples across the world, and I think that generally speaking, when we're thinking about this is a dirty word, privatisation of the NHS. People are scared of it politically, but actually, when we're thinking about privatisation, we don't just look towards the US. There are more than 2 countries in the world, for goodness sake. Let's look to European countries. Let's look at South Asia, where they have more free market healthcare systems and it's delivered better, but they also spend less. We've currently got upwards of 7 million people on waiting lists. It's clear the NHS isn't working and we're spending more than we ever were before.
Okay, so let's compare to Sweden and Singapore. That was the 2 examples she brought up on the LBC. Swedish healthcare is largely tax funded and the overall quality is high. In Sweden, the healthcare system is decentralised, which means that it is managed and run either by regions, local authority or municipality. Health, medical and dental care is divided into public and private sectors. Every county council, local authority or municipality is responsible for managing and prioritising its own healthcare resources. As a result, the type of healthcare services available may vary. Healthcare services provided by a private company under contract with a county council, local authority or municipality. In the event of such contract, the cost of private and public healthcare is the same. Healthcare services provided by a private company under no contract with the National Healthcare Services. As a patient, you are then liable to pay for the full cost of any treatment and care you receive. Patient fees are set by each region and vary across the country. Some visits are generally free of charge, such as child and school healthcare, screening or healthcare for the elderly. It's basically what we have here. The difference is that we don't charge at all for primary care. However, we do with dental care. We have a public and private system, which is still free at the point of use, and is still subject to rules from government regulations. Sweden has just a bit more municipality where powers are devolved to local councils, but largely it's the same as we have. So I'm not sure why she brought up Sweden. Not sure what she means by vouchers, but the idea of vouchers doesn't really sound appealing. Now let's look at Singapore. Primary care at government hospitals is heavily subsidised and sometimes even free for Singaporean citizens and permanent residents, with more deluxe care in private rooms charging extra. Both public and private healthcare in Singapore are subject to government regulations. Singaporeans enjoy universal healthcare, meaning the public health system and mandatory health insurance is funded by the government. Patients can access care in public facilities with ease, but public healthcare is not free. Singapore's public healthcare is funded by taxes, which only cover about 1/4 of Singapore's total health costs. Individuals and their employers pay for the rest in the form of mandatory life insurance schemes and reductions from the compulsory savings plan or the Central Provident Fund (CPF). The basic structure of Lion City's public health insurance system is built around MediShield, MediSave and MediFund. So it's partly funded by the government and is still subject to government regulations. The problem here, though, is that it's not free at the point of use. Now, this is a mix between the NHS and something like Obamacare. Obamacare was actually a right-wing policy imagined by the Republicans. In fact, its original name was Romneycare, which would have been implemented had Mitt Romney defeated Obama in 2012. The idea of Obamacare was that the free market obviously doesn't provide for the needs of its citizens. So under Obamacare, it made it mandatory that people took out health insurance. Now that's a quick fix because it's a consumer side policy rather than attacking the problem at its source, which is profiteering off healthcare. However, it helped reduce costs because it forced more people into getting health insurance, which made the pot bigger. And I'll talk about this point in a second. The whole point of the NHS is that we ration care based on need, not on the size of your wallet. Now, these 2 systems, Sweden and Singapore, are actually closer to the NHS than the model in the US. It's essentially the government having to step in to fix the issues of free market healthcare. Progress would deem that these systems should move closer to taxpayer-funded healthcare, and in Singapore's case, move to free at the point of use. Now, despite Reem Ibrahim trying to muddy this debate and make it out that it's not binary, when it comes to healthcare, it actually is. So, first off, the NHS is an insurance-based system. We need to make that clear. It's not free. We all pay for it through national insurance, but that money is automatically taken out of our taxes. So think of Obamacare, where it's essentially forced participation in health insurance, but the NHS expands it to where the payments are automatically taken through taxes rather than the government mandating citizens choose what healthcare they take out. The funny thing, which right-wingers who support more privatization, especially the US model, is that they say that insurance is the best way forward. Now, an insurance-based system works better when more people have insurance, right? Okay, an insurance company, in order to be successful, they need more customers to pay into the pot. So if they have to pay out for a particular reason, well, the more paying customers means they can afford to do that. In other words, if you have an insurance company with 3 customers, the fee would have to be incredibly high for those 3 customers in order to cover operational costs as well as any payouts. Now, the more customers, the more the pot is shared. Therefore, premiums would go down for each customer. The more people in the pot, the better it is for everyone. So, how about the whole population pays into the pot, like the NHS? Everyone pays in, everyone takes out what they need. Now, this is a huge contradiction in the US system. There are millions of people who are uninsured. There are millions of people who will go bankrupt due to medical debt. So morally, we of course should stay as far away from the US model as possible. But logistically, it doesn't work. Why? Well, you might be surprised to know that the US pays more per capita on healthcare than the rest of the industrialized world. So the US spends more whilst covering less people. Why do you think the NHS was created? Rarely do those in power create things because they care about the population. Of course, there were some incredibly principled people in Attlee's government that believed healthcare is a right, not a privilege. But it's also worth knowing that all parties, including the Tories, supported it. Why? Because the NHS is the natural conclusion to the best and most logical way of healthcare. Anything else is literally going backwards.
Doctors and nurses and pretty much everyone who works in the NHS are saying to us, as they do day in, day out now, we see this is about money, this is about investment. You're turning around and effectively saying you're wrong.
Well, the money isn't reaching them, is it? We've got mid-level management and a huge amounts of bureaucracy within the NHS. So those people are probably right. The nurses and doctors aren't feeling the money, are they? Because the money is being spent elsewhere. The NHS is a huge bureaucratic black hole, and we're just throwing more taxpayer money at it, and it's not working.
Well, there we go with the buzzwords. Huge black hole. Well, it's effective because it exploits the anxiety we all feel around the state of the NHS at the moment. But that's all it is, exploitation. She kind of defeats her own argument by herself because she identifies the problem. Where are we putting the money? Yes, less bureaucracy is better, which is what the Tories did. They promised no top-down reorganisation before the 2015 election, and then they just did it anyway. Another really bad idea, which is bureaucratic, is what I alluded to earlier, which is PFIs. It was Blair that introduced the privatisation in the NHS. We borrowed money from private companies instead of using the taxpayer to fund the NHS. But these companies aren't doing it from the goodness of their heart. They want a return. So we ended up paying more because the investors wanted their profits. This makes it bureaucratic because of private involvement. The NHS comparatively is actually incredibly cheap. It's bang for your buck when it's 100% publicly funded. We don't need private involvement. We don't need the free market. We just need those in power to do their job, which is to fund it properly.